The morning sky above Earth changed color when the alien ships arrived. Admiral Kate Morrison stood on the bridge of her flagship watching the massive black vessels drop out of hyperspace like falling mountains. Each ship was 3 times larger than anything humans had ever built, and their dark metal hulls seemed to swallow light itself. Kate had commanded the Earth Defense Fleet for 12 years, but nothing had prepared her for this moment. Her communication officer, Jake Sullivan, turned from his console with fear written across his young face. The aliens were broadcasting on every frequency at once, and their message was simple and terrifying: surrender or die. The Zephyrian hegemony had arrived at Earth, with 40 massive warships and a reputation that stretched across the galaxy. They had conquered 43 different species, and every single one had either given up without a fight or been completely destroyed within days. Now they floated above Earth like dark angels of death, waiting for humanity to make the same choice every other race had made. Captain Lisa Grant watched the alien fleet from her post on Mars Command. The Red Planet's defense stations were old and outdated, compared to the sleek death machines hanging in Earth's orbit. She had fought pirates and raiders for most of her career, but those battles seemed like children's games compared to what was coming. The aliens had weapons that could crack planets and shields that could stop anything humans could throw at them. Dr. Nathan Cross worked frantically in his laboratory beneath Geneva, trying to make sense of the alien transmissions. As Earth's leading expert on alien life, he had always dreamed of first contact, but not like this. The Zephyrian messages contained detailed information about every species they had conquered, and the data made his blood run cold. 43 civilizations had fallen to these creatures, and each one had been cataloged like specimens in a museum. The aliens gave humanity 72 hours to surrender. President Helen Carter sat in the Situation Room beneath Washington, reading reports from every corner of human space. Earth's colonies on 17 different worlds were all sending the same message. The alien ships had appeared everywhere at once, and their ultimatum was identical across all systems: submit to the hegemony or face total extinction. Supreme War Leader Kethamor commanded the Zephyrian invasion fleet from his flagship, high above Earth's blue oceans. He had personally overseen the conquest of 19 species, and humanity looked no different from any of the others. Their ships were primitive, their weapons were weak, and their military formation showed no understanding of advanced warfare tactics. This would be another easy victory to add to his long list of successful campaigns. Jake Sullivan's hands shook as he translated more of the alien communications. The Zephyrians weren't just conquerors, they were collectors. They studied each species they defeated and kept detailed records of how long each civilization lasted against their forces. The longest resistance had been 6 days. Most species surrendered within hours of seeing the Zephyrian fleet. Dr. Cross discovered something else in the alien data streams that made his stomach turn. The Zephyrians had been watching humanity for months before they arrived. They knew about Earth's defenses, they knew about the colonial fleet, and they knew exactly how many ships and soldiers humanity could bring to bear against them. This wasn't a conquest, it was an execution that had been planned down to the smallest detail. President Carter called an emergency session with her military advisors. General Patrick Moore laid out the situation in terms that left no room for hope. The aliens had more ships, more firepower, and technology that was centuries ahead of anything humans possessed. Earth's best weapons would barely scratch their shields, and humanity's entire fleet wouldn't last an hour against their main battle line. But something strange happened during that meeting. Instead of discussing surrender terms, the conversation turned to how humanity could make the aliens pay the highest price possible for their victory. Kate Morrison suggested Protocol 7, a defensive strategy that had never been tested because it required something no military planner thought was reasonable. It required every human being to fight until they were dead. Lisa Grant received orders from Earth that seemed impossible to believe. Instead of consolidating forces for a final defense, every human ship was to scatter and fight independently. Every colony was to resist until the last person fell. Every station was to become a fortress, even if it meant certain death for everyone inside. The orders didn't make military sense, but they carried the full authority of the president. War Commander Vexithar served under Kethamor and had participated in 12 conquests. He studied the human defensive positions and found them puzzling. Instead of gathering their forces at strong points, the humans were spreading out across their entire territory. It looked like they were trying to make the invasion as difficult as possible, rather than trying to actually win. No species had ever used such a strategy, because it guaranteed maximum casualties for the defenders. Nathan Cross made one final discovery that changed everything he thought he knew about the situation. Hidden in the deepest parts of the Zephyrian communications, he found references to something called the human problem. The aliens had been debating whether to attack Earth for over a year, and some of their leaders had argued against it. The reason wasn't because they feared human military might, but because they were worried about something they called human unpredictability. As the 72-hour deadline approached, Jake Sullivan monitored communications from across human space. Every colony, every station, and every ship was sending the same response to the alien ultimatum. 2 words that would echo across the galaxy and change the course of galactic history forever. Come try. President Carter addressed the people of Earth for what everyone knew might be the last time. She didn't talk about victory or survival or the hope of rescue. Instead, she talked about something that made humans different from every other species in the galaxy. She talked about the simple fact that some things were worth dying for, and freedom was one of them. Kate Morrison gave the order to activate Protocol 7, knowing that it meant the death of everything she had sworn to protect. But she also knew that it meant something else. It meant that when the Zephyrians finally conquered humanity, they would remember this fight forever. They would remember that humans were different from every other species they had faced. The alien countdown reached 0, and the invasion began, but something had already changed in the galaxy. For the first time in their history, the Zephyrian hegemony was about to learn what happened when an unstoppable force met a people who simply refused to be moved. The first Zephyrian landing ships touched down in New Tokyo just as the sun rose over the Pacific Ocean. War. Commander Vexthar led the assault, from his command vessel expecting to see the same thing he had witnessed 43 times before. Terrified civilians running in panic while a handful of soldiers put up token resistance before inevitable surrender. Instead, he found something that made no sense according to every military manual in the Zephyrian database. The humans were not running away from his forces, they were running toward them. Office workers carried makeshift weapons fashioned from construction tools, while elderly humans threw bottles filled with burning liquid at his armored vehicles. Even small human children were helping by carrying ammunition to the fighters and providing intelligence about Zephyrian movements. Colonel Sam Martinez commanded the ground defense of New Tokyo from a subway station that had been converted into a command bunker. His orders were simple but insane by any reasonable military standard. Fight until you cannot fight anymore, then keep fighting anyway. Martinez had served in 3 different wars, but he had never seen anything like what was happening in the streets above his head. Maria Santos had been a kindergarten teacher for 15 years, and she had never held a weapon in her life until the aliens arrived. Now she coordinated civilian resistance from the basement of her school, while her former students helped by crawling through air vents to spy on alien positions. The Zephyrians had expected to find helpless civilians, but instead, they found an entire population that had transformed overnight into guerrilla fighters. The aliens landed with overwhelming force and superior technology, but they discovered something their tactical computers had never calculated. Human beings became more dangerous when they were afraid, and they became absolutely deadly when they were angry. Every block of the city became a battlefield where humans used their knowledge of local terrain to turn everyday locations into killing zones. Captain Derek Morgan led a squadron of human fighters in the orbital battle above Earth. His pilots flew ships that were decades older than Zephyrian technology and carried weapons that barely scratched alien armor. The enemy calculated that human forces had a 0.3% chance of victory, yet somehow Morgan's pilots were scoring kills through tactics that defied all logic. The humans were ramming their fighters into Zephyrian ships when their weapons failed. They were using their own vessels as guided missiles to create openings for their wingmen. They were fighting like they had nothing to lose, because in their minds they truly had nothing left to lose except their pride and their refusal to kneel before conquerors. Dr. Elena Rodriguez worked from a bunker laboratory beneath Chicago analyzing captured Zephyrian technology and biological samples. Her research revealed something that explained why the hegemony had been so successful against other species. Every civilization the aliens had conquered shared one critical characteristic when faced with overwhelming Odds, they calculated the logical response and chose surrender over extinction. But humans did not calculate, they escalated. When faced with impossible situations, they did not look for the smart choice, they looked for ways to make their enemies pay the highest price possible for victory. Rodriguez realized that the Zephyrians had made a fundamental error in their understanding of human psychology. They had assumed humans were like every other species in the galaxy, when in fact they were completely unique. Supreme War Leader. Kethmore received casualty reports from the surface that contradicted everything he knew about warfare. His forces controlled 60% of the landing zones, but they were taking losses at a rate that should have been impossible. Human resistance was not weakening. As their casualties mounted, it was growing stronger and more desperate with every passing hour. The humans were not fighting to win. They were fighting to hurt their enemies as badly as possible before they died. Kethmore had never encountered a species that seemed to view their own survival as secondary to the goal of making their conquerors suffer. His military advisors suggested new tactics, but he dismissed their concerns because no species had ever lasted more than 6 planetary rotations against hegemony forces. Vexthar found himself trapped in urban combat unlike anything in Zephyrian military history. The humans refused to mass their forces for conventional battles. Instead, they turned every building, every street, and every basement into individual fortresses. His soldiers were trained for honor-based combat between organized armies, but the humans fought without honor, using ambush tactics and targeting wounded soldiers for elimination. Maria Santos coordinated with other civilian groups through a network of hidden radios and runners. The humans had prepared for this invasion by creating multiple backup communication systems and supply caches throughout the city. They were not just fighting a military campaign, they were fighting a war of extermination where every human death was designed to cost the aliens as much as possible. Derek Morgan's fighter squadron had been reduced to 6 operational craft, but they continued to attack Zephyrian capital, ships with suicidal determination. The aliens could not understand why the humans kept fighting when victory was mathematically impossible. Their own species would have surrendered days ago when the outcome became clear, but humans seemed to get more aggressive as their situation became more hopeless. Colonel Martinez received reports from defense positions across the city that painted a picture of complete military madness. Human forces were taking 90% casualties in some sectors. Yet the survivors were not retreating. They were calling for more ammunition. Civilian volunteers were stepping forward to replace fallen soldiers, even though they had no military training and almost no chance of survival. Elena Rodriguez made a breakthrough in understanding Zephyrian psychology that would change the course of the war. The aliens had conquered the galaxy by using fear as their primary weapon. They would arrive at a world, demonstrate their overwhelming power, and wait for the logical surrender that always followed. But fear had the opposite effect on humans. It made them angry and angry. Humans were exponentially more dangerous than calm ones. The battle for New Tokyo entered its 3rd day with Zephyrian forces controlling most of the city but taking constant casualties from human resistance that refused to die. Vexthar sent increasingly urgent requests for reinforcements to his superiors, something that had never been necessary in any previous hegemony conquest. The humans were teaching the galaxy a lesson that would echo across the stars. Some species fought for survival, but humans fought for spite, and spite was proving to be the most dangerous motivation the universe had ever encountered. 3 weeks into the invasion, the Zephyrian hegemony controlled 60% of Earth's surface, but their casualty reports defied every mathematical model they possessed. War Commander Vexthar had lost more ships and soldiers in these 3 weeks than the hegemony had lost in their previous 10 conquests combined. For the first time in their military history, he found himself requesting reinforcements from the home fleet. Supreme War Leader. Kethmore studied the tactical displays from his flagship, trying to understand how a primitive species was inflicting such devastating losses on his forces. The humans had no advanced technology, no superior numbers, and no strategic advantages, yet somehow they were turning every battle into a costly nightmare that drained Zephyrian resources. At an alarming rate, Commander Tony Blake led a group of human survivors through the ruined streets of Berlin using tactics that the Zephyrian military computers could not counter. The aliens were programmed for conventional warfare between organized armies, with clear command structures and predictable battle formations. They had no protocols for dealing with humans who hid in sewers, struck from shadows and disappeared into civilian populations before counterattacks could be launched. The Zephyrians had conquered species that fought with honor using established rules of engagement, but humans seemed to have no rules at all. Blake's forces would attack alien supply convoys using children as scouts, then vanish into subway tunnels before enemy reinforcements arrived. They turned shopping centers into ambush sites and used playground equipment to launch improvised rockets at alien vehicles. Lieutenant Sarah Kim found herself trapped behind enemy lines in the Australian outback with what remained of her unit. She had started the war with 50 trained soldiers, but 3 weeks of constant fighting had reduced her force to 12 exhausted survivors. Yet somehow her unit had grown to include 300 civilians, who had joined the fight after watching their homes burn and their families die. The civilians had no military training, but they possessed something the Zephyrians had never encountered in any previous conquest. They were angry, and angry humans became exponentially more dangerous as their situation became more desperate. Sarah watched farmers and shopkeepers transform into ruthless guerrilla fighters who showed no mercy to alien forces and asked for none in return. Dr. Elena Rodriguez continued her research from hidden laboratories scattered across the globe, sharing her findings through encrypted networks that the aliens could not decode. Her analysis revealed that humans were fundamentally different from every other species in the galaxy in one critical way. Other races became more cautious as they faced greater threats, but humans became more reckless and therefore more unpredictable. The Zephyrians had built their entire military doctrine around the assumption that intelligent species would make logical decisions based on survival calculations, but humans seemed to operate on pure emotion, making choices that defied tactical analysis and strategic planning. They would sacrifice entire units to destroy a single enemy vehicle if doing so would send a message to other alien forces. General Patrick Moore commanded human resistance from a mobile command center hidden in the Rocky Mountains. His strategy violated every principle of military science by deliberately spreading the fighting to every corner of the planet instead of concentrating forces at defensible positions. Moore wanted every city, every town, and every farm to become a battlefield where humans could demonstrate their unique gift for escalation. The human doctrine as it came to be known was simple in concept but terrifying in execution. Instead of trying to win battles, humans focused on making every victory cost the aliens more than they could afford to lose. Every human death was designed to take multiple enemies with it, and every defeat was structured to create conditions for future revenge attacks. Moore's forces had turned Earth into a planet-wide trap, where the Zephyrians found themselves fighting not just an army, but an entire civilization that had chosen war over surrender. Every human settlement contained hidden weapons caches, and every survivor was a potential resistance fighter who knew the local terrain better than any alien invader could hope to learn. On Zephyr Prime, the Hegemony Council convened an emergency session for the first time in over 2 centuries. The reports from Earth described impossible scenarios where a conquered population continued to fight with increasing ferocity, even as their military was systematically destroyed. Some council members suggested withdrawal, but Supreme War Leader Kethmore convinced them to deploy their ultimate weapon. The Planet Killer had been used 12 times in Hegemony history to sterilize worlds that posed ongoing threats to alien authority. Kethmore argued that humanity clearly fell into this category, and that complete extinction was the only way to prevent their resistance from inspiring other conquered species to rebellion. The Council authorized deployment of the massive weapon with the understanding that Earth would cease to exist within days of its arrival. Sarah Kim's forces intercepted alien communications about the Planet Killer and transmitted the information to resistance cells across the globe. The news should have broken human morale and led to mass surrenders, but instead it had the opposite effect. Humans who had been fighting for their homes and families now began fighting for the principle that some things were worth dying for even if victory was impossible. Tony Blake received orders from General Moore that seemed insane even by human standards. Instead of seeking shelter from the coming apocalypse, resistance forces were instructed to increase their attacks on alien positions. The goal was not survival, but ensuring that the Zephyrians would remember their conquest of humanity as the costliest victory in their empire's history. Commander Fexthar watched his casualty reports climb to levels that threatened the structural integrity of his invasion force. His soldiers were developing what human doctors would have recognized as combat fatigue, but Zephyrian medicine had no treatment for psychological disorders caused by fighting an enemy that refused to acknowledge when they were beaten. The aliens began reporting incidents where human fighters would continue attacking even after sustaining injuries that should have been immediately fatal. Zephyrian soldiers started requesting transfers off Earth, something that had never happened in any previous conquest. The humans were not just fighting a war, they were fighting a war of attrition, designed to break the will of their conquerors. Elena Rodriguez published her final report on human psychology through resistance networks that reached every corner of human space. Her conclusion was simple, but revolutionary: humans were the only known species that became more dangerous when threatened with extinction. Other races had evolved survival mechanisms, but humans had evolved spite, and spite was proving to be the most effective weapon the galaxy had ever seen. The Zephyrian planet killer emerged from hyperspace like a mechanical moon blotting out the stars above Earth. The massive weapon was 10 kilometers long and contained enough destructive power to crack worlds in half, reducing entire planets to floating debris in a matter of hours. Supreme War Leader Kethmore transmitted his final ultimatum to the human resistance with absolute confidence that no species would continue fighting in the face of total extinction. President Helen Carter received the alien message in her bunker beneath Washington while explosions from the ongoing surface battle shook dust from the concrete ceiling above her head. The ultimatum was simple and final: surrender immediately, or watch Earth die along with every human being in the galaxy. Carter looked at the faces of her advisors and saw the same grim determination that had carried humanity through 3 weeks of impossible warfare. Her response was broadcast on every frequency to every human settlement across 17 star systems and beyond, to listening posts that would carry her words across the galaxy. The message was only 4 words long, but those words would echo through space for generations to come, making it clear that humanity had chosen extinction over submission. Come and take it, Captain. Bill Turner commanded the last operational human fleet from his flagship as it accelerated toward the planet killer on what everyone knew was a suicide mission. Operation Blackout called for a direct assault on the alien superweapon, not to destroy it but to capture it and turn its devastating power against the Zephyrian Empire. The mission had a 2% chance of success, which, as Turner told his crew, meant it was exactly the kind of odds that humans preferred. The human fleet consisted of 47 damaged warships, carrying crews that had been fighting without rest for 3 weeks straight. Their weapons were running low on ammunition, their shields were failing, and their hulls showed the scars of countless battles against superior alien technology. Yet every ship in the fleet was accelerating toward the planet killer at maximum speed because humans had decided that dying on their feet was better than living on their knees. Major Rachel Brown coordinated the final phase of Earth's surface defense from a command post hidden beneath the ruins of Denver. But the defense had evolved into something else entirely, a demonstration broadcast across the galaxy by hidden transmitters that showed every intelligent species what happened when humans were pushed too far. The fighting was no longer about protecting Earth, it was about sending a message that would outlive the planet itself. Dr. Nathan Cross worked frantically in his laboratory analyzing captured Zephyrian technology while alien bombardment shook the building above him. His research had revealed something that changed the entire nature of the conflict. The hegemony had been using psychological warfare for centuries, broadcasting their conquests to intimidate new species before the first shot was fired. But humanity's resistance was breaking their most effective weapon by proving that some species simply could not be intimidated. Cross discovered that the Zephyrians had been monitoring communications across the galaxy, and their worst fear was coming true. On 43 conquered worlds, slave species were receiving broadcasts of the human resistance and beginning to question why they had surrendered so easily. For the first time in hegemony history, their subject peoples were learning that resistance was possible and that conquerors could be made to bleed. Lieutenant Amy Foster piloted her damaged fighter through the defensive screen surrounding the planet killer while alien interceptors swarmed around her like angry insects. Her ship had lost shields, weapon systems, and life support, but she continued flying toward the massive weapon because her orders were clear: reach the target at any cost. Foster represented everything the aliens feared most about humans: the absolute refusal to acknowledge defeat even when victory was mathematically impossible. The human assault fleet smashed into the Zephyrian defensive formation with the fury of a species that had nothing left to lose. Turner's ships were outnumbered 10-1 and outgunned by an even greater margin, but they fought with tactics that defied every principle of space warfare. Human captains rammed their vessels into alien dreadnoughts, creating breaches that boarding parties could exploit, while other ships used the chaos to penetrate deeper into the enemy formation. Rachel Brown watched the orbital battle from her command bunker while coordinating the final acts of defiance taking place. Across Earth's surface, human resistance fighters were attacking alien positions with renewed fury, knowing that their planet would soon be destroyed, but determined to make their enemies pay the highest possible price for victory. Every human death was designed to create maximum psychological impact on Zephyrian forces who had never faced an enemy that grew stronger as it approached extinction. The breakthrough came when Amy, Foster's crippled fighter, broke through the planet killer's defensive screen and crashed directly into the weapon's main power core. The resulting explosion did not destroy the massive device, but it created something far worse for the Zephyrians: a quantum pulse that propagated through hyperspace, carrying detailed information about human resistance to every inhabited world in the galaxy. The pulse contained more than just data about the battle for Earth. It carried the emotional resonance of human defiance that had been building for 3 weeks of constant warfare. Across the galaxy, species that had been conquered by the hegemony received not just news of human resistance, but the psychological framework that made such resistance possible. They learned that surrender was a choice, not an inevitability, and that some things were worth fighting for even against impossible odds. Dr. Cross monitored the quantum pulse as it spread across known space, carrying with it the mathematical proof that the Zephyrian Empire could be defeated. The data showed that humans had inflicted casualties on the hegemony at a rate that made conquest economically unsustainable if applied across multiple worlds. More importantly, it demonstrated that the alien psychological advantage was based on the assumption that no species would choose extinction over submission. Captain Turner's fleet had been reduced to 12 operational vessels, but they had accomplished something unprecedented in galactic history. They had boarded and partially captured a Zephyrian planet killer. The human survivors who fought through the alien ship's corridors were not trying to save Earth anymore. They were trying to ensure that the galaxy would remember what happened when someone made the mistake of threatening humanity with extinction. The quantum pulse reached the edges of known space, carrying humanity's final message to the universe, a declaration that some species could not be conquered because they refused to be conquered regardless of the consequences. The quantum pulse that erupted from the damaged planet killer reached 43 conquered worlds within hours of Lieutenant Amy Foster's sacrifice, and the effect was immediate and devastating for the Zephyrian hegemony. On planet after planet, slave species that had accepted alien rule for generations suddenly began to question why they had surrendered so easily, when humans had shown that resistance was possible even against impossible odds. Admiral Kate Morrison commanded the growing human fleet from her flagship, as it pursued retreating Zephyrian forces across 3 star systems. Her ships now included dozens of captured alien vessels, crewed by humans who had learned to operate advanced technology through necessity and pure stubborn determination. The pursuit was no longer about territory or strategic advantage. It was about ensuring that every alien survivor would carry the message that humans could not be conquered. The first rebellion began on Kepler 7, where a species called the Vorthak had been enslaved for over 2 centuries. The quantum pulse carried not just information about human resistance, but the emotional framework that made such defiance possible. Within days, the Vorthak were attacking their alien overseers using the same tactics they had learned from watching human broadcasts, improvised weapons, hit-and-run attacks, and an absolute refusal to retreat. Even when facing superior firepower, President Helen Carter addressed the United Nations from the rebuilt chambers in New York, while similar messages were transmitted to every human colony and broadcast across the galaxy through the quantum network that had once served Zephyrian conquest. She announced the formation of the Terran Defense Alliance, offering membership to any species willing to stand against tyranny and fight for their freedom, regardless of the odds they faced. The response was overwhelming, 17 different civilizations requested alliance membership within the first day, while reports of rebellions reached Kate Morrison's intelligence officers from across former hegemony space. The aliens had built their empire on fear and psychological intimidation, but humans had proven that fear could be overcome by anger, and anger could be channeled into effective resistance. Supreme War Leader Kethmore faced a tribunal of his own. People on Zephyr Prime, as the empire that had stood for over 1,000 years, began to collapse around him. The charges against him were unprecedented in hegemony history: failure to recognize an apex predator species and triggering a galactic war by attacking the one race that could not be intimidated into submission. His defense that humans appeared primitive and weak fell on deaf ears as casualty reports continued to arrive from across the galaxy. Dr. Elena Rodriguez published her complete research on human psychology through the Alliance Communication Network, and her findings spread like wildfire through scientific communities on dozens of worlds. Her conclusion was simple but revolutionary. Humans were the only known species that became more dangerous when threatened with extinction. Other races had evolved complex survival mechanisms, but humans had evolved spite, and spite was proving to be the most effective weapon against tyranny the universe had ever discovered. The collapse of Zephyrian authority accelerated as more species joined the rebellion inspired by humanity's example of effective resistance. The aliens found themselves fighting wars on 17 different fronts against enemies who had learned human tactics and adopted human attitudes toward impossible odds. Every species that had once cowered before Zephyrian might was now demanding freedom and backing up those demands with violence. Commander Jake Sullivan coordinated the construction of humanity's first interstellar fortress at the edge of former Zephyrian space, using salvaged alien technology and human engineering techniques that the galaxy had never seen before. The fortress served both as a defensive position and as a symbol that humans intended to remain in space permanently, regardless of who might try to drive them out in the future. The fortress bore a simple inscription in 44 languages, one for each species the hegemony had conquered, plus one for the species that had conquered them back. The message was carved into the station's hull, where every passing ship could read it and understand what it meant to threaten humanity with extinction. Here stands humanity. We do not yield. Captain Bill Turner survived the assault on the Planet Killer and now commanded a mixed fleet of human and alien vessels that patrolled the border regions, hunting down Zephyrian remnants who still believed they could restore their empire through military force. Turner's ships carried a new type of warfare to the galaxy, one based on the principle that some enemies were too dangerous to leave alive, and some crimes were too serious to forgive. Dr. Nathan Cross established research stations throughout Alliance, space dedicated to studying the psychological and military techniques that made human resistance so effective against superior forces. His work focused on teaching other species how to channel their natural survival instincts into the kind of focused aggression that had made humans the most feared warriors in galactic history. The Zephyrian Empire officially ceased to exist 6 months after the first alien ships had appeared in Earth's orbit. The last hegemony fleet surrendered to Alliance forces near the galactic core after their crews mutinied, rather than continue fighting an enemy that seemed to grow stronger with every battle. The surrender was unconditional and came with a request that would have been unthinkable just months before the aliens asked for human protection against their own former subjects, who were seeking revenge. Major Rachel Brown established the Alliance Military Academy on the ruins of Denver, where officers from dozens of species came to study human warfare techniques and learn the psychological principles that made effective resistance possible. The Academy's motto was simple but effective: fight until you win, then keep fighting until your enemies remember why they should never have started the war. Elena Rodriguez's research became the foundation for what historians would later call the human doctrine, a military and political philosophy based on the principle that some species could not be conquered because they refused to acknowledge that conquest was possible. The doctrine spread throughout Alliance space, creating a new type of civilization based on mutual defense and the shared understanding that freedom was worth any price. The final Zephyrian survivors established a small colony on the edge of Alliance space under human protection, carrying with them a new addition to their military records. The entry was simple, but complete, describing the one species they had encountered that could not be defeated through conventional means. The humans cannot be conquered, do not attempt to. The warning was transmitted to every corner of the galaxy, ensuring that future would-be tyrants would understand the price of underestimating a species too angry to quit and too stubborn to surrender even when facing certain death.